The emergency room had never been that quiet. 43 people watched a decorated military officer draw his hand back and bring it across a nurse's face. Not a shove, not a grab, but a full, open-palmed strike that snapped her head sideways and sent her badge skidding across the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Weston straightened his uniform jacket, looked down at Nurse Sloane Merritt kneeling on the linoleum, and smiled. He actually smiled. And in the far corner of the waiting room, a man nobody had noticed all evening slowly closed the magazine he wasn't reading, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his phone. If this story already has you holding your breath, follow along, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night shift at Callaway General Hospital started the way most bad nights did. Not with a single catastrophic event, but with a slow accumulation of small disasters that nobody caught in time. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday when Sloane Merritt clocked in for her 12-hour stretch in the Level 2 trauma bay. She was 31 years old, 5'4" in compression socks, and had been working nights at Callaway for the better part of 4 years. She was not beautiful in any way that people photographed. Her dark hair went up in a clip the second she walked through the staff entrance. She had a small scar under her left eyebrow from a bicycle accident at age 9, and she had the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they've spent years learning to stay calm while other people fell apart around them. She was good at her job. That was the whole thing. That was the entire story, as far as the people who worked with her were concerned. Sloane Merritt was good at her job, and she was quiet about it, and she did not make things complicated. She took the harder patients. She stayed late when the board was full. She trained the new graduates without making them feel stupid for not knowing things they'd never been taught. The other nurses noticed. The attending physicians noticed. The hospital administration, specifically the man who ran it, Director Warren Holt, did not particularly notice anything that didn't appear on a quarterly metric sheet. The ER that night was carrying 41 patients across the department. Bay 3 had a 67-year-old man, Gerald Fiore, who'd come in by ambulance from a construction site with a suspected internal bleed. The paramedics had handed off his chart with a note that his pressure had dropped twice in the rig. Sloane had read it on intake, flagged it immediately to the attending on duty, Dr. Priya Nambiar, and started positioning Gerald for imaging before Nambiar even got to the bay. "You prepped him already?" Nambiar said, scanning the chart. "Pressure's been inconsistent since transport. Didn't want to wait on authorization for the abdominal ultrasound." Nambiar looked at Gerald, looked at the readings, and said, "Good call." She signed off and kept moving. That was the kind of nurse Sloane was. Bay 3 was in the middle section of the ER, separated from the waiting area by a long corridor and a set of double doors with small windows. The waiting room itself was the kind of space that accumulated human misery in layers. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor. A television mounted too high for anyone to watch comfortably. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look either dead or on the verge of it. On a Tuesday night in late October, it held somewhere between 35 and 40 people at any given time. Some of them had been waiting hours. Some of them were calm. Several were not. Sloane was reviewing Gerald's ultrasound preliminary results. There was fluid where fluid should not be, when the double doors opened hard enough to hit the wall. She looked up. The man who walked in was wearing a military dress uniform. Dark jacket, brass buttons, ribbons on the left breast that caught the overhead light. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, and he moved through the corridor like he expected it to empty in front of him. He had a bandaged hand, the right one, wrapped in what looked like a home-applied field dressing, not professional, tape gone a little loose at the edge. Behind him, 2 paces back, was a younger man in civilian clothes carrying a jacket that matched the uniform's color, like a personal aide who'd been allowed to change. The officer scanned the space, found the nurse's station with his eyes, and walked directly to it. Sloane was 10 feet away, still looking at Gerald's results on the wall-mounted screen. "I need a bed," the officer said. Not loudly, not rudely, yet, just with the specific cadence of someone who had spent a long time saying things once and having them happen. The charge nurse on duty, a 38-year-old man named Tomas Rueda, looked up from his station. Sir, what's the nature of your injury? Laceration, hand. It needs to be sutured. Tomas looked at the bandaged hand. How long ago did this occur? About 90 minutes. Okay, sir. We're currently at capacity, but I can get you registered and triaged, and we'll have someone with you as soon as... I don't need to be triaged. I need a bed, and I need it now. I have a meeting in 4 hours, and I'm not spending that time in a waiting room. Tomas kept his face neutral. Sir, our triage protocol. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Derek Weston. I'm stationed at Faro Air Base. I want to speak to whoever's in charge of this floor. Sloan had stopped pretending to look at the screen. She turned around. Tomas glanced at her. Not for help exactly, but with the look of someone who was doing a calculation and wasn't sure of the answer. Then he said, I'll page the charge supervisor. No need, Sloan said. She walked toward the station. Derek Weston turned to look at her. He took her in the way people sometimes take in rooms, quickly, categorically, without much interest in what they find. I'm Sloan Merritt, trauma nurse. Mr. Rueda handles triage intake. What he told you is accurate. We're at capacity and every patient in this department has been triaged according to severity. A suturable laceration is stable. I can get you registered and into triage queue, and you'll be seen when a bay opens. Weston looked at her badge, looked at her face. You're a floor nurse. Trauma nurse, yes. Then this isn't a decision you're authorized to make. It is, actually, she said. Triage prioritization is within nursing scope here. If you have concerns about the policy, I can get you the department director's contact information. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not yet. More like adjustment, like a man recalibrating how he needed to handle a conversation that was not going the way he'd written it in his head. I've served this country for 22 years, he said. I have a government clearance that would make your employment history look like a grocery list. I came to this hospital for medical care, and what you're telling me is that I need to sit in that room and wait. That's what I'm telling you, yes. The aide behind him shifted his weight. Sloan? Tomas said it quietly, not as a warning, just as an acknowledgement that the temperature in the corridor had changed. I'll tell you what, Weston said, his voice dropping half a register in the way that sometimes precedes volume and sometimes precedes something worse. You're going to get me a bed in the next 5 minutes, or I'm going to make a phone call that results in a very long conversation between your hospital director and the base commander at Faro. And I think we both know how that conversation ends for the nursing staff that caused the problem. Sloan looked at him. She had seen this before. Not this exactly, not this man, not this specific set of decorations and threats, but the structure of it, the offer of institutional damage, the implication that her job existed at the pleasure of people with more power than she had. I have a patient in Bay 3 who may be bleeding internally, she said. When I finish what I'm doing with him, I will personally check whether a bay has opened up and come find you in triage. That's what I can offer you right now. She turned and walked back toward Bay 3. Gerald Fiore's pressure had dropped again. But she spent the next 22 minutes with Gerald. Nambiar had been paged back, and they had a surgical consult on the phone when Gerald's pressure hit a number that moved everything else in the department to secondary. The surgical team was prepped and called down. An orderly repositioned equipment. Sloan started a second IV line, because the first was already running and Gerald's veins were cooperating, barely, and she was working with her hands and her attention and the very specific part of her brain that did this, that held all the variables at once without dropping any of them. While somewhere in the corridor behind her, a man with ribbons on his chest was doing a slow boil about a wait time. She was aware of Weston the way you're aware of weather through a window. Present, potentially significant, but not the thing directly in front of you. Gerald stabilized enough for transport. The surgical team took him. Sloan pulled off her gloves, wrote up her notes in the system, and checked the board. 2 bays had opened in the last 15 minutes. She flagged Tomas. Weston still in triage? Unfortunately, Tomas said. Pull him to Bay 6. She went to Bay 6, pulled the curtain, gathered what she needed for a laceration assessment, irrigation kit, suture tray, lighting. She was setting up when she heard the footsteps in the corridor, and then Weston was in the doorway with his aide behind him. Bay 6. she said, not turning around. Sit on the table. He didn't move immediately. She could feel it, the deliberate pause, the not sitting. Then he crossed the bay and sat. She put on fresh gloves, positioned the light, and said, "Let me see your hand." He held it out. She unwrapped the home dressing. The laceration was across the palm, 3 inches, not deep. It had stopped bleeding, but it would need sutures, maybe 7 or 8, nothing complicated. She irrigated it, and he didn't flinch, which she noted not because it impressed her, but because it told her something about his calibration. Pain tolerance high, or pride overriding it. "How did this happen?" she asked. "That's not relevant. It's relevant to whether there's debris in the wound. A beat. Glass. Window." She cleaned the site carefully. "Any medical history I should know about? Allergies to local anesthetics?" "No. I'm going to use lidocaine for the block. You'll feel pressure, not pain." She was prepping the syringe when she heard footsteps in the corridor again, and then Director Warren Holt was in the doorway. Warren Holt was 53, administrator built, the kind of man who wore his suit jacket into spaces where other people wore scrubs. He had a particular expression he used for situations that involved people he needed to manage, a kind of studied concern, like someone performing attentiveness. "Lieutenant Colonel Weston," he said, crossing the bay and extending his hand. "Warren Holt, hospital director. I'm sorry for the wait. I hope we can take good care of you tonight." Weston shook his hand without standing. "Your staff needs some education on the concept of professional courtesy." Holt's eyes moved to Sloan, who had not stopped preparing the suture tray. "I understand there was some confusion earlier," Holt said. "We're going to make sure you're taken care of." "I'm taking care of him," Sloan said. "I'm setting up a lidocaine block now." Holt looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite warning, wasn't quite request. "Ms. Merritt, why don't I have one of the other nurses?" "I'm already set up. It'll take 12 minutes. She looked at Holt directly. "Unless you'd like him to wait while someone else restages everything." There was a pause in which Holt calculated something. "Go ahead," he said, and left. Weston watched the doorway Holt had disappeared through, then turned to look at Sloan. "He seems to know his place," Weston said. "You might want to take notes." She administered the lidocaine block without responding. She sutured his hand with 8 stitches, cleaned the site, applied a sterile dressing, and gave him written care instructions. He did not thank her. He did say, just before he stood to leave, "You're going to want to be more careful about who you make wait in this hospital." Sloan finished writing in his chart and did not look up. "Take care of that dressing. If you see any redness spreading, come back." He left. She stripped her gloves and went to the small supply room at the end of the corridor, the one that was used for overflow storage and which had become, over 4 years, the place where the nursing staff briefly decomposed before going back out to do it again. She stood in there for 2 minutes. She drank the rest of the water bottle she'd started 6 hours ago. She thought about Gerald Fiore and surgery and whether his pressure would hold. Then she went back out. The waiting room at 1:15 in the morning had not thinned the way waiting rooms sometimes did after midnight. There were still 30-some people in those plastic chairs, some of them asleep sitting up, one child pressed against a mother's side with a wrapped ankle. The television was running a home renovation program with the sound off. The fluorescent lights were the same as they always were. Sloan was walking back toward the nurses' station when she became aware that something in the waiting room had changed. She felt it before she understood it. A particular stillness, a collective held breath. Weston was standing in the middle of the waiting room. He hadn't left. He was talking on a phone, his freshly dressed hand at his side, and he was not talking quietly. He was saying something about incompetence and disrespect, and making sure certain people understood consequences, and several of the patients nearby had gone very still in their chairs. Then he turned and saw Sloan standing in the corridor doorway. He ended the call. He walked toward her. "Who's your nursing director?" he said. "Karen Osei. I'm going to make sure you're reviewed. I'm going to make sure this hospital understands what happened here tonight. And I'm going to make sure you, personally, Lieutenant Colonel Weston," she said it evenly. "You received care. Your wound is sutured. If you have concerns about your treatment, the patient advocacy number is on your discharge paperwork. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the calculation of before, not the controlled authority. Something older, something that had not been moderated. He took 2 steps forward. Nobody in the waiting room moved. "Let me explain something to you," he said, low and controlled, and she could hear the effort in it, the precision of a man holding back weight. "You are a nurse in a county hospital. I have been in this country's service for 22 years. I have people who answer my calls in 20 minutes, regardless of the hour. You have a badge that can be taken. Do you understand the difference?" "I do," she said. "Then act like it." She held his gaze. He raised his hand. It was not telegraphed the way these things sometimes are in movies. No wind-up, no dramatic pause. It was simply a motion, quick and flat, and his palm connected with the left side of her face hard enough that she stepped back once and caught the doorframe with her shoulder to keep from going down. The sound of it was what everyone would remember later. Not the aftermath, not the silence. The sound. Dry and sharp, like a crack in something load-bearing. Sloane straightened. Her face was hot where it had been struck, heat spreading from her cheekbone toward her jaw, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. She looked at Derek Weston. He straightened his jacket. He looked back at her. "Know your place," he said. Her badge was on the floor. It must have caught on something when she stepped back, the clip snapping off the pocket. It lay face up on the linoleum 6 feet away, her photo visible even from a distance. That slightly terrible ID photo they always took under the worst lighting. 34 people in the waiting room had witnessed what happened. Not one of them spoke. Not one of the staff members visible through the corridor doorway moved. Weston's aide stood by the main entrance with his face doing something it clearly didn't know how to do. Weston straightened his jacket once more, gave the room a final look. Practiced, unhurried. The look of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd ever occupied, and walked toward the exit. At the far end of the waiting room, in a chair that faced the corridor doorway at an angle, a man who had been sitting very still for the past hour looked down at the phone in his hands, tapped something once with his thumb, and then slowly lifted his eyes to the doors that Weston had just walked through. Sloane was still in the doorway. Her hand had come up to her cheek and then dropped, because she was aware of being watched, and she would not be seen doing that in this room, not right now. Tomas appeared at her shoulder. "Sloane, I'm fine." That was, I know what it was. She looked at him. "Pull the waiting room camera footage, right now, before anyone touches anything." Tomas looked at her for a moment, taking in her face, taking in whatever expression she was managing to hold. And then he said, "Already on it," and moved. The next 4 hours rewrote the shift in ways Sloane hadn't prepared for. She filed an incident report at 2 a.m. By 2:45, Warren Holt had been called back to the hospital. He arrived at 3:10 in a different suit jacket. She noted it absently, evidence that he'd gone home at some point, and asked to meet with her in his office before the shift ended. She sat across from him at 6:15 with the fluorescent hangover of a 12-hour night behind her eyes, and something deliberate in the way she was keeping her posture. "I want to tell you how seriously we take this," Holt began. "Good," she said. "We're going to conduct a full internal review. There's camera footage from the waiting room." "Yes, which we'll include in the review." He paused. "Sloane, I want to be straightforward with you. Lieutenant Colonel Weston is connected to this hospital in ways that go beyond last night. Faro Air Base has a contract arrangement with our network. The base commander has a seat on our advisory board." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that affects what we do here," Holt said. "I'm saying it's complicated, and I think the most productive path is what exactly?" He put his hands flat on the desk. "Is for you to let the review process run without making formal criminal complaints while we're still gathering information. It gives us leverage with the base's JAG office. If you file directly with the police tonight, it becomes an adversarial situation before we've had a chance to—" "You're asking me not to file a police report. I'm asking you to give us 72 hours to handle this internally first." Sloane looked at the desk. She looked at the window behind him where the sun was starting to come up. Early November gray-pink, the kind of sunrise that looked like it was working hard and might not make it. "I'll think about it," she said. Holt nodded, relaxing a fraction. I'll also need to see that incident report before end of day today, she said, to confirm it accurately reflects what I filed. He nodded again, less relaxed. She stood and left his office and walked to her car in the staff lot and sat in it for 11 minutes without starting the engine, watching the sunrise that wasn't quite going to make it, and something that had been very contained inside her chest since 1:15 in the morning began to do the thing it had been waiting to do. She did not cry. That was not what it was. It was more like a recognition, not of what had happened. She'd known what had happened from the second her shoulder hit the doorframe, but of what was already being set in motion. The 72 hours, the internal review, the advisory board seat, the complicated. She had been in hospitals long enough to know that complicated was how institutions said, this is going to cost you more than him. She started the car and drove home. She slept 4 hours. Not well. When she checked her phone at noon, there were 2 messages from hospital numbers and one from a number she didn't recognize with a 571 area code that she looked up and identified as Virginia, Northern Virginia, the specific geography of government buildings and people who worked in them. She stared at that one for a while and didn't call it back. At 2 in the afternoon, she received a formal notification through the hospital's HR portal that she had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into a patient interaction on the overnight shift. She read the language 3 times. Patient interaction. Her. She was the subject. The notification cited a concern about nursing conduct during what it described as a disputed exchange. Her hands were steady when she put the phone down. She had trained them to be. At 2:40, she called a former colleague, a nurse she'd worked with before Callaway, before this job, before the life she'd built here, and she said, very calmly, I need a lawyer recommendation, employment and civil. Someone who doesn't back down when the other side has money. She listened to the response, wrote down a name and number, and said, No, I'm fine. I'll explain later. She hung up. She was standing at her kitchen window looking at the parking lot of her apartment complex, unremarkable mid-morning activity, someone loading groceries into a trunk 2 rows over, when her phone rang from that 571 number again. She answered it. Ms. Merritt, a man's voice. Not young, not old, the specific kind of level that suggested controlled rather than natural. My name is Cole Rader. I was in the waiting room of Callaway General Hospital last night. I'd like to talk to you about what I saw. She didn't say anything for a moment. How did you get this number? She said. It took some doing, he said, which tells you something about whether I was serious about calling. She looked at the parking lot. The person with the groceries had finished and driven away. What do you do, Mr. Rader? A pause. I think that's a conversation better had in person. I'm currently at a coffee place called Dunmore's on Alcott Street. I'll be here until 4. And if I don't come? Then you don't come, he said, but I think you should. She thought about the administrative leave notification, the 72 hours, the incident report she'd asked to see and hadn't yet been sent. I'll be there at 3, she said. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that Cole Rader had spent the 4 hours between leaving the hospital and making that call, reviewing documents that would take her breath away. She didn't know that the small notebook he'd had in his jacket pocket last night was now full of notations in a handwriting so compressed it was almost private code. She didn't know what he'd seen in that waiting room, or more precisely, she didn't yet know all of what he'd seen, because the hit, the strike, the crack of it across her face had been one thing. But Cole Rader had also recognized Derek Weston the moment he walked through those ER doors, and recognition, in his line of work, was only the first step. The second step was already underway. Dunmore's was the kind of coffee shop that had been in the same location long enough to stop trying. Mismatched chairs, a counter that had been refinished once too many times, a chalkboard menu where someone had drawn a small cartoon coffee cup in the corner that nobody had erased in what looked like years. It smelled like roasted beans and old wood, and the particular warmth of a space that had absorbed 10,000 conversations. Sloan arrived at 2:58. She was still in the clothes she'd slept in, which wasn't something she'd noticed until she was parking the car. She'd changed her shirt, but forgotten about the rest of it, which told her something about her current cognitive state that she filed without much comment. Cole Rader was at a corner table with his back to the wall. Mid-50s, maybe. Compact the way some men were compact. Not small, just efficient, like nothing about him was there without a reason. He had a coffee in front of him that was mostly finished, and a legal pad with handwriting on it that he turned face down when she approached. Not quickly, just deliberately. "Miss Merritt," he said, and stood. "You can sit," she said, and pulled out the chair across from him. "What did you see last night?" He looked at her. "Everything." "That's not specific?" "I know." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I watched you turn him away from the fast track. I watched the director come down and smooth it over. I watched you suture his hand. I watched him come back into the waiting room afterward, and I watched him hit you." He said the last 4 words without any particular inflection, which was its own kind of statement. "I also watched you not go down." She said nothing. "And I watched the aide," Rader said, "the one standing by the door. He didn't react, not surprised, not alarmed, like he'd seen it before." That landed somewhere in her chest, and she felt it, but she kept her face where it was. "Who are you?" "Retired," he said. "Defense Intelligence Agency. 12 years active, 4 years contract after that." He said it the way people said things that were simply true, without wanting credit for them. "I'm in Callaway doing some private consulting work. Background checks for a regional firm. It's about as exciting as it sounds." "And you recognized Weston?" "The moment he walked in." He moved the mug slightly to the left, an inch, like he needed to adjust something. "I knew Derek Weston in a professional capacity 7 years ago. Not closely, but enough to know certain things about him that were, let's say they were known in certain circles and handled in certain ways that I always thought were inadequate." Sloan put her forearms on the table. "What kind of things?" He looked at her for a moment, as if recalibrating how much to say in what order. "There was an incident in 2017. An enlisted woman at Faro filed a complaint against Weston for conduct that was eventually described in the formal proceedings as inappropriate physical contact. She was transferred within the month. The complaint was closed with a finding of insufficient evidence, which in this context is a specific kind of bureaucratic language that means someone made a call and that someone had enough rank to make it stick." Sloan was quiet. "There was a second incident in 2019, Rader said. "A contract employee. Different base, same type of complaint, same outcome. I only know about these because of the consulting work I did at the time. I had access to records that most people don't." He paused. "I'm telling you this so you understand what you're dealing with. This is not a man who lost his temper once. This is a pattern with a protection mechanism built around it." A server came by and Sloan ordered a coffee she didn't want because her hands needed something to do. When the server left, she said, "The hospital is telling me to wait 72 hours before I file a police report." Rader's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. "Who told you that?" "The director, Warren Holt." "And you're considering it?" "I'm sitting here instead of at a police station," she said, "so draw your own conclusions." He nodded slowly. "Here's what I think happens in 72 hours. The incident report gets revised. The camera footage gets, not erased necessarily, but the custody chain gets complicated. Someone at the base makes a call to someone on that hospital advisory board. And when you eventually do file a report, the documentation that should support your account has developed some problems." He picked up his mug and then put it back down without drinking. "I've watched this process work 3 times. It works because the person who's been harmed waits, and while they wait, the system that protects the person who harmed them runs." Sloan looked at him. The coffee shop moved around them. 2 women at a laptop near the window, a man reading something on his phone by the door, the low sound of a milk steamer from behind the counter. "What are you suggesting?" she said. "File today. File now, before you leave this table." He said it quietly. "And then I need to show you something." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the table and slid it toward her. She unfolded it. It was a printout. Recent. The date at the top was from 3 days ago. From what looked like a federal contractor database. It had Derek Weston's name on it and a series of contract numbers. And under the contractor column, a company name she didn't recognize. Aldrin Systems Group. "I don't know what I am looking at," she said. Aldrin Systems Group is a defense procurement subcontractor with a registered address in Delaware and an operational office in Virginia. It was incorporated 4 years ago. He paused. Its primary officer of record is Weston's brother-in-law. Its 3 largest contracts over the past 4 years have been awarded through a procurement channel where the evaluating officer was someone in Weston's direct command structure. Sloan looked up from the paper. He's funneling contracts. That's one interpretation, the one I favor. Rader took the paper back and folded it. And it's not something I discovered last night. I've been running a parallel line on this for about 6 weeks for a client I can't name. Last night in that waiting room it was not part of my assignment. It was a coincidence. He said the word like he didn't fully believe in them. But it became relevant when I watched what he did to you, and I understood the pattern I was already looking at from a different angle. Her coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around it and did not drink it. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Why not take whatever you have and give it to whoever you're working for and let it go through channels?" "Because channels take time," he said, "and because what he did to you last night was not a side issue. It is the same behavior, the same belief that consequence doesn't apply to him. And if last night gets buried the way the other incidents got buried, then whatever I'm building on the procurement side loses something important. It loses the most recent, most visible, most documented version of who this man is." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you because what he did to you matters by itself. But I'm also telling you because together, these things are harder to make disappear." Sloan sat with that. Outside the window, a bus went past on Alcott Street, the kind that was mostly empty mid-afternoon, one person visible in a window seat looking at something in their hands. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon, city just continuing on around them. "I need to talk to a lawyer first," she said. "Of course. And I need to see that incident report before I decide anything else." "That's smart." He put a card on the table. Plain card, just a number. "When you're ready to talk further, call me on that number only, not email." He paused. "And Ms. Merritt, move quickly. The 72 hours they asked you for isn't a courtesy, it's a timeline." She filed a police report at 4:47 that afternoon. The officer who took her statement was professional and thorough and wrote everything down without editorializing, which she was grateful for. She gave him the incident time, the location, the witness count, the specific description of the strike. When he asked her if she wanted to pursue a formal assault charge, she said yes without hesitating. The lawyer she'd been given the name of, a woman named Diane Sato, whose office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a view of the river, called her back within an hour of her leaving the message. They spoke for 40 minutes. Sato asked precise questions and did not tell Sloan what to feel about any of it, which was the right thing to do. At the end of the call, she said, "I want that incident report the moment you can get it, and I want to know the second anyone from the hospital contacts you about signing anything." "They already have," Sloan said, and described the administrative leave notification. There was a brief silence. "That was fast," Sato said, and the way she said it told Sloan she'd already begun calculating. The incident report came through the HR portal at 6:20 p.m. Sloan opened it on her laptop and read it twice. The report described an interaction between nursing staff and a patient during which a verbal altercation occurred. It noted that the patient had expressed dissatisfaction with wait times and that the exchange became elevated. It mentioned that a physical contact incident took place, which was described as under review pending witness interviews. Her name appeared twice. In one instance, she was described as having declined to accommodate patient concerns. And in a second instance, the language was the interaction may have been escalated by nurse communication style. It did not mention the waiting room. It did not mention the 34 people who had watched. It did not use the word assault. She sat there for a long moment. Then she forwarded it to Diane Sato, texted Cole Rader the single word. Moving, and opened a new document on her laptop to begin her own written account of the night, from the moment she clocked in to the moment she sat in her car in the parking lot. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote everything. The times, the exchanges, the exact words she could remember, the exact sequence. She wrote about Gerald Fiore and his blood pressure numbers because those mattered, because they were the reason she'd been where she was when she needed to be. She wrote about Holt's suit jacket and the 72 hours and the coffee shop on Alcott Street and Cole Rader's hands around his mug. She was not a perfect witness to her own experience. She knew that. She'd been a nursing professional long enough to know that memory under stress was unreliable and selective and sometimes wrong about details. So she marked the parts she was certain of, and she marked the parts she was reconstructing, and she sent the whole thing to Sato with a note that said, "This is my account as accurately as I can render it. Flag anything that needs clarification." Then she sat in her kitchen in the quiet that had settled over the apartment since she'd gotten home, and she thought about the aide by the door, his face doing something it didn't know how to do. Not surprised. Quotes. By the following morning, two things had happened that Sloan hadn't anticipated. The first was that Tomas Rueda had been placed on administrative leave as well, cited for procedural irregularities during patient intake. She found out through a group message from another nurse at Callaway that arrived at 7 a.m. She stared at it for longer than was useful, feeling something that was half guilt and half a colder, cleaner anger. Tomas had pulled the camera footage. That was the procedural irregularity. They had put him on leave for doing exactly what she'd told him to do. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. "I figured you'd call." "Tom, I'm sorry." "Don't." His voice was even, tired but even. "I pulled it because it was the right call. Same reason you said to pull it." A brief pause. "The footage exists. I confirmed it with security before they put me out. Whether it stays in one piece after today is a different question." "Sato's filing for a preservation order this morning," Sloan said. "Good." He paused again. "How's your face?" She touched her cheek. The bruising had come in overnight, purple-green at the cheekbone, tender when she moved her jaw. She hadn't looked at it this morning yet. She had a feeling looking at it would cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. "I've had worse," she said, which was not entirely true. "Sure you have." His voice had something in it that was almost dry humor, almost. "Watch yourself, Sloan. They moved fast." They had moved fast. That was what she kept coming back to. The second thing that had happened by morning was a voicemail from a number she traced to a law firm based in Harrisburg, a firm that represented, among other clients, the Weston family. The message was brief and professional and made no explicit threats. It conveyed that Lieutenant Colonel Weston was prepared to characterize the events of Tuesday night very differently from the way Ms. Merritt had characterized them in her police report, and that the legal team was hopeful a resolution could be reached before the matter became a distraction to all parties. She listened to it once and sent the recording directly to Sato. Sato's response arrived 20 minutes later. "Good. This helps us. Don't call them back." Sloan didn't intend to. What she did intend to do, what she found herself doing at 9 a.m. in her kitchen with a second cup of coffee she was actually drinking this time, was thinking about Cole Rader and the paper he'd put on the table. The contract numbers. Aldrin Systems Group, a brother-in-law and a procurement channel, and 4 years of work that had been invisible precisely because it was designed to be. She thought about what Rader had said, that what Weston did to her and what Weston had been doing with contracts were the same thing, essentially, the same architecture, the same conviction that he was outside the reach of ordinary consequence. She believed that was true. She had believed it at the coffee shop, and she believed it now, when belief was harder and the bruise on her face had come in overnight like a map of something she hadn't yet finished understanding. She called Rader at 9:15. "They put Tomas Rueda on leave," she said when he answered. "The nurse who pulled the footage." "Yes." A pause. "Then they know the footage is there and they're trying to isolate who has access to it." "Sato's filing for a preservation order." "That'll help. But a preservation order takes time to execute, and time is the thing they're buying," she said. "I know." She looked out her kitchen window. The parking lot was different at 9 a.m. than it was at noon. Fewer cars, more light, a quality of morning that was almost ordinary. "Cole, what you have on the procurement side, how close are you to something that can move?" A silence that was not hesitation, but calculation. "The documentation I have establishes pattern and motive. What it doesn't have yet is the transaction records that connect Aldrin directly to Weston's personal accounts. That piece is with a contact I have at a federal level who I've been working with for several weeks." "How close are they?" "Days," he said. "Not weeks." She thought about Tomas in his apartment this morning, on administrative leave for doing the right thing. She thought about the Harrisburg law firm and their hopeful resolution. She thought about Warren Holt across his desk, telling her it was complicated. "How do I get in front of your federal contact?" she said. Another silence. When Rader spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Not cautious exactly, but precise in the way people got precise when they knew what they were about to say had weight. "You understand that if you do that, there's no version of this where you step back out. Whatever arrangement the hospital was offering, whatever settlement Weston's lawyers are building, you walk away from all of it." "I know," she said. "You're sure?" She looked at the bruise in the window's reflection. Just a smudge of color in the glass, barely visible at this angle, but there. "Set up the meeting," she said. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing in that moment, was that while she was standing in her kitchen making that call, Warren Holt was in his office at Callaway General signing a document that her lawyer had not been shown and had not been given the opportunity to contest. A document that described Sloan Merritt's administrative leave as the preliminary stage of a termination proceeding, initiated on the grounds of conduct unbecoming, failure to follow protocol, and, the line that would matter most in the weeks ahead, falsification of a patient interaction report. Her incident report. Her account of what happened. They weren't just burying what Weston had done, they were making her the one who'd lied about it. The termination document hit Diane Sato's inbox at 11:14 a.m., forwarded by a paralegal who'd been monitoring the hospital's legal filings as a precaution Sato had set up the night before. By 11:30, Sato had called Sloan and read the relevant language aloud over the phone in the flat, precise tone of a woman who had seen this kind of maneuver before and was already 3 steps ahead of it. "Falsification of a patient interaction report," Sato said. "That's the operative charge. Everything else, conduct unbecoming, protocol failure, those are padding. The falsification allegation is what they're using to reframe the narrative. They're not denying an incident occurred. They're saying your account of it is a lie." Sloan was standing in the middle of her living room. She hadn't sat down since the call started. Can they make that stick? Not if the camera footage holds and the witnesses are reachable, but they're moving to discredit you before either of those things can be established on record. A brief pause. "I'm filing an emergency injunction to halt the termination proceedings and a concurrent motion for evidence preservation covering all camera systems, access logs, and HR communications from the past 72 hours. I need you to send me the contact information for every staff member who was in or near that corridor when it happened. Tomas has names. He was pulling witness contacts before they put him on leave. Get them from him today, this afternoon." After she hung up, Sloan stood in the living room for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at nothing in particular: the wall, the corner where her running shoes sat, the kitchen she'd been standing in an hour ago when the morning still felt like something she could navigate. Then she called Tomas, got the names, and spent 40 minutes typing them into an email to Sato. 7 names. 7 people who had been in that waiting room and who worked for the hospital that was now building a case against her. She sent the email and did not think too hard about what it was going to cost some of those 7 people to tell the truth. Cole Rader's federal contact turned out to be a woman named Agent Vera Okafor, and she turned out to be not the kind of person Sloan had pictured. They met at noon in the parking structure adjacent to the federal building on Whitmore Street, which Okafor had apparently chosen because it was not the federal building itself. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a charcoal blazer over a dark shirt, and she had the particular quality of attention that made Sloan feel, for the first time in 36 hours, like she was being looked at by someone who was actually interested in accuracy. "Rader told me what happened at the hospital," Okafor said. "She did not say I'm sorry or anything adjacent to it. I need you to understand what I can and can't do with that information." They were standing near the structure's east wall, away from the parked cars, the ambient noise of the city coming up from the street below. Rader stood slightly apart, giving them room. "I'm listening," Sloan said. "The assault you reported is a local criminal matter. I can't touch it directly. Jurisdiction, scope, that's PD and DA territory. What I can tell you is that the criminal complaint you filed today creates a public record that is much harder to disappear than an internal hospital report." Okafor said it practically, not to comfort her. What I'm working on is a separate federal investigation into procurement irregularities connected to contracts awarded through Faro Air Base. Weston is a material subject in that investigation, not a peripheral one. Rader said you were days away from transaction records. Okafor looked at Rader briefly. He told you that. Is it accurate? A pause that was honest rather than evasive. We're waiting on financial records from a bank in Delaware that processes Aldrin Systems' primary accounts. The subpoena was executed 4 days ago. Banks have 10 business days to comply. We're on day 4. She said it without apology. A timeline was a timeline. What I need from you is a formal statement about the events at Callaway General that I can attach to our investigative file as context. A pattern of behavior document. What Rader witnessed plus your account creates a picture of someone who has operated without accountability across multiple domains over a significant period. That matters for how a federal case gets built and how it gets prosecuted. Sloan looked at her. You want me to be useful to your case? I want you to be useful to the truth, Okafor said, which, in this situation, happens to align with my case. She said it without flinching. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That, Sloan thought, was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 2 days. She gave the statement in Okafor's car, recorded on a device that Okafor placed on the center console between them. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not editorialize. She gave times, sequences, specific language. When she was done, Okafor stopped the recording and they sat in the parked car for a moment in the particular quiet of a statement that had just been made and could not be unmade. One more thing, Okafor said. Do you know what Weston was at the hospital for? He said a laceration, glass from a window. Okafor looked at the steering wheel for a moment. The night before he came to your ER, there was a disturbance at an off-base residential property connected to a person in his personal life. Local PD responded. Report was filed, then amended within 6 hours. Ooh. She looked at Sloan. The amended report does not mention Weston by name. Sloan felt the shape of that land and settle. The laceration, she said, is consistent with broken glass in the context described in the original report. Okafor left it there. She didn't need to build the bridge out loud. I'll be in touch. Chab. Sloan drove back to her apartment with the kind of focus that had nothing to do with traffic and everything to do with the architecture of what she was inside, because she could see it now, the whole structure of it, not just her piece, but the larger thing. Weston in that waiting room had not been a man who lost his temper at the wrong place and wrong time. He had been a man who had spent 22 years learning that his behavior had no permanent consequences, that incidents got amended and reports got rewritten, and people who pushed back found their situations becoming complicated. He'd walked into her ER already intact from the night before, already protected, and she had been, to him, simply the next person who needed to understand that. She was still thinking about that when her phone rang and the name on the screen was Karen Osei, the nursing director who had been CC'd on Sloan's original incident report filing and who had not, in the 30-some hours since, made contact. Sloan answered. Sloan. Osei's voice was careful in a way that told Sloan the call was not entirely private. I wanted to reach out directly. I've been trying to understand the full picture of what happened. Have you seen the camera footage? Sloan said. A pause. I've seen the security report. That's not the same thing. No, Osei said. And in that single word, Sloan heard something, not agreement exactly, but an acknowledgement that she knew the difference. I'm limited in what I can discuss while the internal process is active, but I wanted you to know that there are people here who are paying attention. Tom Rueda is on leave, Sloan said, for pulling footage of a crime. I know. Are you paying attention to that? Silence. Then, be careful, Sloan. Please. Osei ended the call. Sloan sat in her car in her parking lot for the second time in 2 days, engine running this time, heat blowing from the vents because the temperature had dropped, and she hadn't noticed until now. Be careful. It was what people said when they couldn't say anything else but didn't want to say nothing. She understood that. She also understood that Osei's call had been made from a workplace phone, which meant it was logged, which meant someone might be paying attention to who the nursing director was calling during an active internal proceeding. Osei had called anyway. Sloan turned off the engine and went inside. The injunction Sato filed hit the hospital's legal team late that afternoon, and the reaction was fast enough to be clarifying. By 4 p.m., Sato had received a response proposing a mediated settlement conference. Confidential, no admission of wrongdoing, a financial arrangement that Sato described over the phone as significant and specifically structured to include a non-disclosure component. They want silence, Sloan said. They want documented, enforceable silence with financial incentive. Sato said it cleanly. The number they floated is not nothing, Sloan. I want to be clear with you about that. It's real money. And in exchange, I retract the police report and sign an NDA and don't talk about any of this. Substantially, yes. Sloan looked at the document she'd been building on her laptop, her own timeline, now 12 pages, cross-referenced with the times she remembered and the entries she'd made in the hospital charting system that night. Gerald Fiore's intake time, the imaging flag, the second IV. All of it time-stamped in a system she hadn't altered and that the hospital would have difficulty altering without creating a more visible problem than the one they were already managing. No, she said. I had to present it. I know, tell them no. She heard Sato writing something. They'll escalate. The next step is probably an aggressive legal challenge to the police report itself, arguing procedural irregularities in how you filed. Let them, Sloan said. I need them busy with that while Okafor's timeline runs out. A pause. Who's Okafor? Sloan hesitated 1 second too long. Sloan. Sato's voice had changed slightly. The way voices changed when someone's calculation shifted. If there's a federal element here that I don't know about, I need to know about it. I cannot protect you across a gap in information. So Sloan told her, not everything. Not Rader's specific documents, not the Delaware bank subpoena, but the shape of it. The procurement investigation, Weston as a subject, the statement she'd given that morning. Sato was quiet for a moment when she finished. You gave a statement to a federal agent without consulting me first. Yes. That was, you should have called me. I know. Another pause. All right, what's done is done. She could hear Sato thinking, the slight sound of movement that meant she was pacing. If there's an active federal investigation with Weston as a subject, that changes the legal landscape considerably. It doesn't protect you from what the hospital is doing, but it does mean that any settlement they're trying to force has a potential obstruction dimension if they knew about the federal case. Do they know? Unknown. But if Weston knows, and if he's sophisticated enough to have protected himself this long, he probably suspects something is moving, then the settlement push might be less about protecting him from you and more about creating a clean break before something larger lands. Sloan thought about that. The speed of it. The termination document signed the same morning she'd filed the police report. The settlement offer within 6 hours of the injunction. They're not running out the clock, she said. They're trying to close the door. Yes, Sato said, which means we don't let them. Day 3 started with something Sloan hadn't expected. One of the 7 witnesses called her. Her name was Adrienne Park, a registration clerk who'd been at the front desk during the overnight shift and whose view of the corridor had been partially obstructed but not entirely. She was 26. She called at 7:15 a.m., and her voice was shaking slightly in the specific way of someone who had made a decision and was calling before they could unmake it. I told HR yesterday that I didn't see anything clearly, she said. They asked me to come in and give a written statement, and I told them my view was obstructed. A pause. That's not entirely true. Sloan kept her voice level. Okay. I saw him hit you. I saw the whole thing. I have a 6-year-old. I need this job. Her voice broke once, quickly, and she pulled it back. But I also can't. I keep thinking about it. I keep seeing it. Adrienne, Sloan said carefully, I'm not going to ask you to do anything. This is your decision. I know. She was quiet for a second. I want to talk to your lawyer. Sloan exhaled slowly, in a way Adrienne probably couldn't hear. I'll have her call you in the next hour. She hung up and called Sato immediately, and then sat with her coffee going cold beside her and thought about the weight of what that phone call had cost Adrian Park to make. The 6-year-old. The job. The decision made before she could unmake it. Sato called Adrian. 2 more witnesses called Sloan that day, both of them unprompted, both of them having heard through the hospital's informal network. The texts and break room conversations and group chats that HR directives couldn't reach. That someone was actually building a case. By end of day 3, Sato had signed statements from 3 witnesses, 2 of them with clear sight lines to the corridor. That evening, Rader texted a single line. Bank records early. Okafor says tomorrow. Sloan read it twice. Then she put her phone down and went to bed at 9 p.m. for the first time since this had started and slept 6 hours without waking, which was not enough, but was more than she'd expected. The bank records arrived in Okafor's office at 8:43 the following morning, and they were, as Rader had promised, complete. What they showed, what the transaction records from Aldrin Systems' primary account established across 4 years of data, was a payment structure that had been built to look like ordinary contractor disbursements, and had functioned, in practice, as something else entirely. The money flowed from defense contracts through Aldrin's operating account into a secondary account that was nominally a consulting firm and was, in substance, a shell. From there it moved in amounts calibrated to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, a practice with a specific name in financial crime, a name that featured in the report Okafor's team began assembling that morning at 9 a.m. Weston's name was not on the shell account. His was on the advisory agreement with the consulting firm signed 4 years ago, which entitled him to quarterly payments for strategic guidance. The payments totaled, across 4 years, a number that made the settlement his lawyers had offered Sloan look like pocket change. At 10:15, Okafor called Rader. At 10:30, Rader called Sloan. It's moving, he said. Okafor's team is coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. This goes to a federal grand jury, not a local complaint. Weston's legal team doesn't know yet. Sloan was standing at her kitchen window again, different morning light, 4 days on from the night in the ER. The bruise on her cheek had settled into yellow-green at the edges, the deep purple at center beginning to fade in a way that looked worse than it had fresh. She'd stopped avoiding mirrors. "What about Holt?" she said. "The hospital director." "That depends on what the investigation establishes about his knowledge of Weston's background when he asked you to wait 72 hours. A pause. "Okafor is being careful about scope, meaning she might not go after him, meaning she's building a case she can win, not the case that satisfies every possible account of wrongdoing." Rader said it without apology. "That's how federal prosecution works. You take the strongest elements, and you don't let the perfect outcome become the enemy of the prosecutable one." Sloan understood that. It didn't mean she liked it. "When does Weston find out?" "When they're ready to move. Could be days." He paused. "The timing is going to matter for your situation. Once this goes public, the settlement pressure disappears because there's nothing left to settle. But until then, they're still going to push." She was about to respond when her phone buzzed with another call. Sato's number. "I have to take this," she said to Rader, and switched over. "The hospital served papers an hour ago," Sato said. "They're formally contesting the police report on procedural grounds, and they've filed a counterclaim against you for defamation." Sloan sat down. She hadn't meant to, but she sat down. "Defamation," she said. "Weston's personal attorneys joined the hospital's filing. They're alleging that your account of the incident has been shared with media contacts and constitutes a deliberate effort to damage his reputation." A pause. "Sloan, have you talked to any journalists?" "No." "Anyone outside of me, Rader, and the federal agent?" "My former colleague, the one who gave me your name, and Tomas." "Okay." Sato's voice was doing the calculating thing. "This is aggressive, but it's also... it tells us something. They don't usually file defamation when they're confident. They file it when they're trying to bury the other side in legal cost and make the whole thing expensive enough to walk away from. I'm not walking away." "I know." A beat. "But Sloan, the defamation filing changes what I can do for you on a contingency basis. I need to talk to you about retainer structure. The sentence landed with its full weight. Legal fees, the cost of not walking away. How much? Sloan said. Sato gave her a number. Sloan looked at her kitchen. The apartment she'd been in for 3 years, the lease coming up in February, the savings account she'd built slowly and carefully, and which now represented a specific number of months between her and very bad options. Give me until tomorrow morning, she said. She hung up. She sat in her kitchen with her cold coffee and the yellow-green brews and the defamation filing and the federal timeline that was days away from something enormous, and she thought about Adrienne Park calling at 7:15 a.m. before she could unmake the decision, and she thought about Tomas saying, "Watch yourself, Sloan," and she thought about Gerald Fiore's blood pressure dropping in Bay 3 while a man with ribbons on his chest demanded a bed. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, local area code. She picked up. The voice on the other end was male, young, clipped in the way of someone reading from something they'd been given rather than speaking naturally. Ms. Merritt, I've been asked to inform you that Lieutenant Colonel Weston is prepared to withdraw all legal actions, including the defamation filing, in exchange for a conversation, not mediation, not a formal proceeding, a conversation. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at Callaway General, the director's conference room. Sloan said, "Who asked you to make this call?" "I'm not authorized to say." "Then I'm not authorized to agree to anything." She kept her voice flat. "If Lieutenant Colonel Weston wants a conversation, he can have it through my attorney." A pause. "He specifically requested it be without counsel present." The line went quiet for a moment, the city noise underneath it, and Sloan looked at the far wall of her kitchen and understood exactly what this was. Not a de-escalation, not a genuine offer. A room without lawyers, a conversation without record. A situation where whatever was said could later be described any way the more powerful person chose to describe it. "Tell him no," she said, and ended the call. She sat there for a full minute. Then she called Rader back. "Someone just called me," she said. "Weston wants a meeting, no lawyers, tomorrow morning at the hospital." Silence on his end, brief and complete. "Cole," she said, "what happens if he finds out about Okafor's investigation before she's ready to move?" The pause that followed was the kind that happened when someone was deciding how honest to be. "He runs," Rader said. "Or he does something worse than run." Sloan looked at the phone in her hand. "Then we need Okafor to move first," she said. And Rader said, "I know. But she's not the only one who decided to move today." "Who else?" Sloan said. Rader took a breath. "Weston's JAG attorney filed an emergency motion this afternoon to seal the procurement records connected to Faro Air Base. The motion names Okafor's investigation directly, which means someone inside the federal building talked. Okafor knows. She's moving the timeline up, but that also means she needs to execute before his attorneys get a judge to sign the seal order, and that window is somewhere between 18 and 36 hours. Sloan stood up from the kitchen table. He already knows. He knows something is moving. He may not know how far along it is. A pause. The meeting request, the one without lawyers, that's not him trying to de-escalate. That's him trying to get in a room with you and find out what you know and who you've talked to. She thought about the voice on the phone. Not authorized to say. Not authorized to agree. The specific language of someone who'd been given a script and nothing else. "What do I do for the next 18 hours?" she said. "Nothing that puts you in a room with him," Rader said. "And stay close to your phone." She stayed close to her phone. The 18 hours were not quiet. They had the quality of the hour before a weather event. Everything in its place. Nothing obviously wrong. The air simply carrying more pressure than it should. Sato called at 7 p.m. to report that the defamation filing had been expanded to include Rader by name, alleging that he was a party to a coordinated campaign against Weston's reputation. "They found out he was in the waiting room," she said. "Someone ran his name and found his DIA background, and now they're building a narrative that this was a setup from the beginning." "That's insane," Sloan said. "It's a legal strategy," Sato said. "It doesn't have to be true. It has to be expensive and confusing and buy them enough time to survive the next 48 hours. A pause. "How are you holding up?" It was the first time Sato had asked her that. Sloane noticed it. "I'm okay," she said, which was roughly half accurate. She was functional. She was sleeping in stretches. The bruise on her face was yellowing at the edges in a way that looked like it was trying to resolve into something normal, which struck her as slightly absurd given the circumstances. "How are you holding up? You've been on this for 4 days straight." A brief, surprised pause. "I'm fine. This is what I do." But something in Sato's voice warmed slightly, like the question had landed somewhere it hadn't expected to. "Get some sleep, Sloane. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, regardless of how Okafor's timeline runs." She slept 4 hours. Not well, but not the fragmented vigilance of the previous nights. Something deeper, like her body had made a decision independent of her. At 6:15 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Raider. "Okafor moves at 9. Be reachable." She was reachable. She was in her kitchen with real coffee and the lights on against the early gray outside, and the 12-page document open on her laptop, not because she needed to read it again, but because she needed to see it. The thing she'd built from her own memory and her own handwriting and her own account of what was true. At 7:40, Tomas called. "I'm at the hospital," he said. "Tom, you're on leave. I came to pick up some personal items I left in my locker." A pause with something in it. "While I was here, I had a conversation with one of the security staff. The camera footage from the waiting room it was flagged for deletion yesterday. Standard retention purge, or at least that's what the order said." Sloane's chest tightened. "Sato filed a preservation order." "I know. And Vasquez, the security tech, he knew about the preservation order because I told him about it when I pulled the footage originally. He didn't delete it." Another pause. "But someone submitted the deletion request under his login credentials while he was off shift. He caught it when he came in this morning and reversed it. The footage is still there." A beat. "But Sloane, someone in that building used his credentials to try to erase evidence after a court preservation order had been filed." The words landed in her chest with the specific weight of something that was no longer just institutional pressure, no longer just complicated. This was obstruction. This was someone inside Callaway General committing a crime to protect Derek Weston. "Who has access to Vasquez's login?" she said. "IT admin, department heads, and, theoretically, the director's office." She was already dialing Sato on the other line before Tomas finished the sentence. Sato took the information about the deletion attempt and moved with the speed that Sloane had come to recognize as her operating mode under pressure. No wasted words, no dramatic reaction, just immediate action. She filed an emergency supplemental motion within 40 minutes that incorporated the deletion attempt as evidence of ongoing obstruction, named Warren Holt's office as the likely point of origin given credential access, and requested an immediate judicial review of all HR communications from the previous 72 hours. "This changes things," Sato told her. "In our favor, significantly." At 8:50 a.m., Sloane's phone rang from Okafor's number. "We're executing at 9, Okafor said. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly." "Where?" "Faro Air Base. Weston is on base this morning. We confirmed his location 20 minutes ago. We'll have him there rather than at a public location." A brief pause. "Your criminal complaint, the assault charge, that's local jurisdiction, separate from what we're doing today. But what we're doing today is going to make it considerably harder for anyone to continue pressuring you. I want you to know that." "I know," Sloane said. "Then, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Okafor said. "It's still a process." And she ended the call. Sloane sat with her phone in her hand. 9 a.m. The same time Weston had requested a no-lawyers meeting at the hospital. She wondered if he was still expecting her to show up, some part of him still operating on the assumption that the architecture of protection he'd built over 22 years was intact. She wondered what it looked like from inside that assumption, whether it felt like confidence or whether it felt, by now, like a room with a leak he hadn't found yet. She put the phone down and drank her coffee and waited. What happened at Faro Air Base at 9:14 a.m. on a Wednesday in November was not the kind of thing that generated immediate public visibility. Federal execution orders were served, not announced. The base's JAG office was notified simultaneously with the base commander, a procedural courtesy that was also a mechanism for preventing internal warning systems from activating before the relevant parties were already in custody. Weston was in his office. His aide was in the outer office. The door opened and Okafor walked in with two other agents and a U.S. Marshal, and whatever Derek Weston had believed about his Wednesday morning was revised completely in the space of about 90 seconds. Sloane didn't know the specifics of those 90 seconds until later. What she knew at 9:22 was a text from Rader that said, "Done. He's in custody. Federal hold." She read it 3 times. She did not feel what she'd expected to feel, which was something large and clean. She felt instead a complicated deflation. Not disappointment, but the specific exhaustion of adrenaline that had been running for 5 days, finding that its reason had resolved, and not knowing immediately what to do with itself. Her hands were steady on the coffee cup. Her face was still bruised. Tomas was still on leave. The defamation filing was still active. Adrienne Park had still made a phone call at 7:15 a.m. that had probably cost her something. None of that was fixed by 9:22 a.m. It was just differently shaped now. She texted Rader back. "What about Holt?" His reply took 4 minutes. "Okafor's scope is Weston and the procurement chain. Holt is your civil case, and the obstruction filing Sato submitted this morning. Different track." She'd known that. She'd known it, and she still had to see it written out. She called Sato. "I heard," Sato said before Sloane could speak. "Rader's contact network is faster than mine, apparently." "This is good, Sloane. This is very good." A pause that was almost the first unprofessional pause Sato had taken in 5 days. "How are you?" "Still working on it," Sloane said. The shape of what had been built against her did not collapse all at once. That was the part the movies never got right, Sloane thought. The way that justice, when it came incrementally and procedurally and with significant paperwork. But the Harrisburg law firm called Sato at 11 a.m. to withdraw the defamation filing. Not with explanation, not with apology, simply with withdrawal. Sato told her it was the fastest litigation retreat she'd seen in 14 years of practice, which told them both that Weston's personal attorneys had been monitoring the federal situation and had made a rapid calculation about the value of continued association. Warren Holt's calculation took longer. By mid-afternoon, the judicial review of HR communications that Sato had filed for had been granted, and a court-appointed reviewer arrived at Callaway General to collect server-side copies of all emails, internal memos, and system access logs from the relevant period. Sloane knew this was happening because Tomas texted her a single word, subpoena, at 2:47 p.m., followed by a photograph of a document being handed to a man in a suit in the hospital lobby that she recognized from the angle and the partial face as Warren Holt. Holt's expression in the photograph was the particular expression of a man who had convinced himself that the structure he was inside was solid and had just received specific information that it was not. At 4 p.m., Holt's attorney contacted Sato's office to discuss, in preliminary terms, the possibility of a cooperation arrangement regarding the credential access logs and the deletion request. Sato called Sloane immediately after. "He's going to give them the deletion order," Sloane said. "That's the direction this is heading, yes." Sato's voice had the careful neutrality of a lawyer who was about to give information with complicated dimensions. "If he cooperates fully, it limits his criminal exposure. It does not eliminate it. The preservation order violation is documented, and the credential misuse is documented regardless of whether he cooperates. Cooperating determines whether he faces federal obstruction charges or whether that becomes a local prosecutorial matter." A pause. "It also means he gives up whoever specifically authorized the deletion. If that traces back to a direct conversation with Weston's team, it becomes evidence in the federal case. So Holt, trying to protect himself, ends up building the case against Weston further. Potentially, yes." Sloane sat with that for a moment. Warren Holt in his suit jacket, 72 hours, the word complicated. A man who had made a calculation about which direction power ran and had built his entire response on that calculation and was now discovering in real time that the calculation had been wrong. "What does that mean for my termination?" she said. "The termination proceeding is, at this point, unsupportable," Sato said. The falsification allegation was authored under the same institutional authority that just agreed to cooperate with a federal inquiry into document interference. Their own cooperation undermines their position against you. I'll file for full reinstatement tomorrow morning. Sloan looked at the wall. And the criminal complaint against Weston? The assault charge. That's the DA's office now. The federal custody doesn't eliminate the local charge. It complicates the timeline, but the DA has your statement, 3 witness statements, and camera footage that a court preservation order protected from deletion. She paused. That charge is not going away, Sloan. It's going to move slowly because everything in the system moves slowly, but it's there and it's real, and it has documentation behind it that is now part of a federal record. After she hung up, Sloan sat in the quiet of her apartment for a long time. Outside, the November afternoon was going dark the way it did now, early, abrupt, like the light simply had somewhere else to be. She could hear traffic from the street below, a door somewhere in the building. The building's heat system doing the thing it did in cold weather, the faint metallic sound of pipes doing their work. Ordinary sounds. The world continuing. She called Tomas at 5. They're reinstating you too, she said. Sato thinks by end of week. A silence. Then roughly, good. Tom. Yeah. I'm sorry it cost you what it cost. He was quiet for a moment. You know what's funny? I've been on leave for 4 days and I've slept more than I have in 6 months, still. He paused. You did the right thing. So did I. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not. After she hung up, she allowed herself to feel, briefly and without commentary, the weight of what the past 5 days had been. Not just for her, for Tomas, for Adrienne Park with her 6-year-old, for the 6 other witnesses who'd been positioned between their jobs and their consciences, for Gerald Fiore, who had made it through surgery and whose care she'd flagged from across a corridor while a man in ribbons demanded her attention, and who had no idea that his blood pressure dropping in Bay 3 had been the specific reason she'd been standing in that doorway at 1:15 a.m. when everything changed. The world was full of invisible chains of causation like that. She'd learned that in nursing before she'd learned anything else. At 6:45, Rader texted her. Okafor wants to meet tomorrow. Says there are secondary subjects in the procurement case. I think you'll want to hear it. She texted back, What time? 10 a.m. Same parking structure. She set her phone down and went to make something to eat, which she'd been forgetting to do adequately for 5 days, and which her body was now demanding in fairly specific terms. She made eggs, badly. She'd never been a particularly skilled cook, and the distraction of the last week hadn't improved her technique, and ate them standing over the sink and thought about tomorrow. Secondary subjects. The procurement chain ran through Weston, but Weston was not a man who built things alone. The shell company, the quarterly payments, the contract evaluation channel, none of that existed without people at each stage who had made decisions and taken money and looked away from things they were paid to look away from. She was still thinking about that when her phone rang at 7:50 p.m. Unknown number. Different area code than the ones she'd been receiving. This one she didn't recognize. She answered. Ms. Merritt? A woman's voice, older, very controlled. My name is Patricia Weston. I'm Derek's mother. Sloan said nothing. I know this is irregular, the woman said. I don't have any, I'm not calling on his behalf legally. I just wanted to speak with you directly. A pause. I know what he did to you. Sloan held the phone and waited. I've known about him for a long time, Patricia Weston said, and her voice had the specific flat quality of a woman who had made a decision to say a true thing and was now committed to it regardless of what it cost. Longer than most people. And I made choices about what to say and what not to say and who to protect and why. I made choices that I've had to live with and that you've had to live with too, because the people I chose to protect weren't the right ones. A very long pause. I'm not asking for anything. I don't expect you to forgive anything. I just needed you to know that someone in this family saw it clearly. Sloan looked at the window. Night now, full dark, the apartment lights reflected back at her. Why now? She said. Because now it doesn't matter what I say to the wrong people anymore, Patricia Weston said simply. There are no wrong people left to protect him from. The line was quiet for a moment. Then the older woman said carefully, "There's a box in storage with Derek's name on it, documents going back to 2014. Some of them are about the company, the shell company, the payments. Some of them are about other things, things that didn't make it into whatever the federal investigators have built." A pause so precise it felt intentional. "I'm going to give it to Agent Okafor tomorrow morning. I thought you should know before it happens." Sloane's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of other things?" she said. And Patricia Weston, in the voice of a woman who had been quiet for a very long time and had finally decided that silence had cost more than it was worth, told her. The box was beige, standard file storage, the kind that came in packs of 10 from any office supply store. It sat on the back seat of Patricia Weston's car through the night and arrived at Okafor's office at 8:41 the following morning, carried by a 71-year-old woman in a gray coat who had driven 2 hours from a suburb Sloane had never heard of and who handed it to a federal agent without ceremony or visible emotion, signed a chain of custody form, and declined the offer of coffee. Sloane wasn't there for any of that. She knew it had happened because Okafor called her at 9:03 and said, "The box is here. I need to push our meeting to 11. There's more than I expected." "How much more?" Sloane said. "A significant amount more." A pause. "Come at 11. Bring Sato if she's available." She called Sato, who rearranged her morning without complaint, and at 11 a.m. they were both sitting across from Okafor in the same conference room where Sloane had given her initial statement, except this time there were 2 other people in the room. A younger agent named Prescott, who hadn't been there before, and an assistant U.S. attorney named Marcus Del Rey, who had the specific alertness of someone who had been handed something significant and had not yet slept. Okafor put her hands flat on the table. "What Patricia Weston brought us this morning," she said, "goes beyond the procurement case we'd already built. The documents include personal correspondence, handwritten notes, and printed communications going back 11 years. They establish a pattern of behavior that extends the federal case from financial fraud into a second category of criminal conduct." She paused. "There are 4 additional women, 5 incidents. 2 of them overlap with the period covered by our procurement investigation, which creates a conspiracy dimension. Specifically, evidence that financial resources from the Aldrin Shell account were used to pay for private legal representation in cases that were settled confidentially." The room was quiet. "He used the money," Sloane said. "Not a question." "The same money from the fraudulent contracts," Okafor confirmed, "to pay lawyers who negotiated silence agreements. Which means the financial crime and the conduct pattern are not parallel tracks. They're the same track." She looked at Sloane directly. "Your case is not an isolated incident. Your case is the one that didn't get buried in time." Sato beside Sloane made a note on her legal pad. Her handwriting was small and even, and she didn't look up when she said, "The Shell account payments funding the NDAs, that's the connection that turns 2 separate federal charges into a single racketeering count." "That's what Del Rey is working on this morning," Okafor said. Del Rey nodded once. He hadn't said anything yet. He had the expression of a man computing something with a very large number of variables. Sloane looked at the table. 11 years, 4 other women. 5 incidents that had been managed, contained, wrapped in confidentiality, and paid for with money stolen from defense contracts that were supposed to fund military equipment for soldiers overseas. The architecture of it was almost elegant in its terrible efficiency. The fraud funding the concealment enabling the fraud, everything circular and self-reinforcing and invisible because it was designed to be. "Patricia Weston," Sloane said. "She knew about the other women?" "She knew about some of them. She suspected more. She found the box in 2019 in a storage unit registered in her son's name that she'd co-signed for in 2008 and apparently forgotten about until she received a renewal notice after his arrest." Okafor paused. She said she spent 3 days deciding what to do with it. 3 days. A woman sitting with a box of her son's crimes, deciding. Sloane didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple. It was the specific mess of a person who had protected the wrong person for a long time and then, in the end, hadn't. She didn't feel gratitude for it. She didn't feel contempt either. She felt something more like the recognition that people were capable of doing the right thing at the wrong time, and that the right thing still mattered even then. "What happens now?" she said. Del Rey spoke for the first time. "We're filing a superseding indictment. The original procurement fraud charges stand, and we're adding counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction for the NDA payment scheme. The existing federal hold on Weston is extended. Bail is going to be opposed given the scope and flight risk profile." He said it evenly, the way lawyers delivered information that was devastating by nature, but professional in delivery. "We're also notifying the 5 women named in the documents. They'll have the option to participate in the prosecution or not. Their previous NDAs are unenforceable because they were funded through criminal proceeds, which voids the contracts." The NDAs were void. Sloan thought about what that meant. 5 women who had signed documents they'd believed were permanent, who had built their silence around those documents like walls, discovering that the walls weren't real. That would not be uncomplicated. That would not feel like freedom immediately. It would feel like a door opening into a room they'd locked themselves out of and hadn't been in for years. "Is there anything else you need from me?" she said. "Your testimony," Okafor said. "When this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, we want you on the stand. What he did to you in that ER is the most public, most witnessed, most documented instance of a pattern we now have 11 years of evidence for. The jury needs to see the pattern from its most recent point backward, not from 2014 forward." She held Sloan's gaze. "You're not just a victim in this case. You're the reason the pattern is visible at all. If you hadn't filed that police report on day 1, if you'd taken the 72 hours, Patricia Weston might still be sitting with that box." Sloan hadn't thought of it that way. She thought of it now, sitting in that conference room, and it was not a comfortable thought. The contingency of it, the way things could have gone differently at any of a dozen junctions. If she'd sat in Holt's office and said, "All right, 72 hours. If she hadn't called Tomas immediately about the footage. If Rader hadn't been sitting in that waiting room with his magazine he wasn't reading and his notebook with the compressed handwriting. None of it was inevitable. All of it had been a choice, every step made by imperfect people who were tired and scared and doing it anyway. "I'll testify," she said. Warren Holt resigned from Callaway General 6 days later. He did not do it quietly. He released a statement through the hospital's communications office that described his resignation as a personal decision made in the interest of the institution during a period of scrutiny, which was the specific language of a man trying to preserve the appearance of agency over a situation that had removed his agency entirely. The cooperation agreement he'd reached with the U.S. Attorney's Office required him to provide full documentation of all communications with Weston's legal team during the critical 72-hour period, to give a sworn deposition regarding the deletion request and its authorization, and to make no public statements contradicting his cooperation agreement. The statement he'd released was carefully worded to avoid doing that while saying as little as possible about anything. Sato sent Sloan the statement with a single line. He had no good options. He picked the least bad one. The hospital board appointed an interim director, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Hartman from the hospital's surgical division, who had been on the board for 2 years and who called Sloan directly on her second day in the role. "I want to meet with you," Hartman said. "Not about the legal situation. I'm aware your attorney handles that. I want to meet with you about what you experienced in this institution and what this institution needs to change." Sloan had not expected that call. She was standing in her kitchen. She kept ending up in her kitchen for significant phone calls, she'd noticed. And she held the phone and thought about the right answer. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll call you." Hartman said, "Of course." And that was it. No pressure, no agenda pre-announced. Just the offer left on the table for Sloan to pick up when she was ready. Tomas came back to work on a Thursday. Sloan knew because he sent her a photo of his locker, reopened, his spare pair of compression socks hanging from the top hook. She sent back a thumbs up, and then sat with her phone for a moment and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 weeks, something adjacent to normal. Not normal itself. Normal had been revised significantly and would continue to be revised, but adjacent to it, the outline of a life that still had shape. Her own reinstatement was formalized the following Monday. Full back pay for the leave period. The falsification allegation formally withdrawn and expunged from her personnel file. A letter from the board, stiff, institutional, drafted by legal and signed by Hartman, acknowledging that the original incident had been handled improperly and that the actions taken against her during the internal review period were inconsistent with the hospital's stated values. She read the letter twice. It was, as these documents always were, more useful as a legal record than as an expression of anything genuine. The words were correct without being felt. She understood that. She filed it with Sato and did not paste it to her wall. What she did keep was something different, a card that Adrienne Park left at the nurses' station on Sloane's first day back. Small card, generic floral front, and inside in handwriting that was careful and slightly uncertain. You made it possible for me to do the right thing. I don't think I would have done it on my own. Thank you. Sloane put that in her locker. The criminal assault charge against Derek Weston moved through the local court system on the slower timeline that Sato had predicted. He was arraigned on the assault count in county court while simultaneously facing federal charges that made the assault arraignment feel, in news coverage terms, almost secondary. But it was not secondary. Sloane made sure it was not secondary by showing up to every scheduled hearing, sitting in the gallery with Sato, visible and present, not performing anything, just there. The federal case was what made the papers. Weston was denied bail at the federal level on the grounds of flight risk and the scope of the conspiracy charge. He was held at a federal facility pending trial on 12 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. The superseding indictment was 43 pages. Delray's office held a press briefing that Sloane did not attend but watched on her laptop at home, sitting cross-legged on her couch with a mug of tea that went cold while she watched a federal attorney describe, in plain language, what had been done and how and for how long. The 4 women named in Patricia Weston's documents were identified in the indictment as Jane Doe complainants, their names protected. 2 of them, within 3 weeks of being notified that their NDAs were void, filed their own civil suits. Sloane didn't know their names. She knew what had been in the box, or enough of it to understand the weight of what each of them had been carrying since the year their particular incident had been resolved, managed, paid for with stolen money, and made to disappear. She thought about them more than she expected to. She thought about what silence cost, paid out incrementally over years, the way it shaped how you moved through rooms, how you thought about institutions, how much of your own account of your own experience you were willing to trust. She thought about the fact that she'd been lucky, in a specific and uncomfortable way. Lucky that Rader had been in that waiting room. Lucky that Tomas had pulled the footage before anyone thought to stop him. Lucky that the strike had happened in front of 34 witnesses rather than in a corridor, in a supply room, somewhere without cameras and without people who could be subpoenaed later. The other women hadn't been lucky in the same way. That wasn't their failure. It was the structure. The structure was designed to catch the unlucky ones and release the lucky ones back into a world that would never fully understand what it had cost them to get out. She sat with that for a long time. She met with Sylvia Hartman on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after her reinstatement, in an office that still had Warren Holt's furniture in it, but nothing else of him. The bookshelves rearranged, different papers on the desk, a plant on the windowsill that had definitely not been there before. Hartman was direct in a way that Sloane found immediately easier than Holt's managed concern had ever been. She was 60, had spent 20 years in surgical practice before moving into administration, and had the particular quality of someone who still remembered what the floor felt like from the inside. I want to restructure how patient complaints and staff incident reports are handled, Hartman said. Specifically, I want the reports to go somewhere outside the direct management chain of whoever is named in the complaint, an independent pathway. She looked at Sloane. I want your input on what that looks like. You know exactly where the system failed because you were inside it when it failed. Sloane looked at her hands on the table. You need a staff advocate who reports to the board, not to the director. Someone whose job it is to receive complaints and protect both the complainant and the integrity of the report before it gets anywhere near people who might have an interest in managing it. Yes, Hartman was writing. What else? Witness documentation protocols. When a staff member files an incident report that involves a patient interaction with multiple witnesses, there should be an automatic process for collecting witness information within the first hour, not 72 hours later. Time is what they used against us. Hartman wrote that too. She looked up. What else? They talked for 90 minutes. Sloan did not hold back. She had notes, because she'd been thinking about this for 3 weeks in the background of everything else, the part of her brain that was always running problem assessment, even when the rest of her was in crisis. She talked about response timelines and documentation chains, and the specific vulnerability of overnight staff who didn't have administrative backup available when incidents occurred. She talked about the way institutional loyalty had been weaponized against Tomas for doing exactly what a good employee should do. She talked about Adrian Park. Hartman listened to all of it and wrote most of it down, and at the end said, "Would you be willing to consult on the design of the new protocols, paid consulting, separate from your nursing role? We'd form a small working group." Sloan looked at the plant on the windowsill. It was a pothos, slightly unkempt, one vine trailing down toward the floor in a way that suggested it had been doing that for a while, and nobody had bothered to redirect it. "Yes," she said, "under one condition." "What's that?" "Tomas Rueda is on the working group." Hartman smiled. The first time Sloan had seen her smile, small and brief and real. "Already planned," she said. The assault trial, the local criminal charge, Weston's palm against her face, 1 a.m. in a waiting room in November, went to court 14 months after the night it happened. It was not the largest proceeding Weston faced. It was not the most complex. The federal case had already consumed considerable legal bandwidth and had, by the time the assault trial began, resulted in Weston pleading guilty to 4 of the 12 federal counts as part of a negotiated agreement that Del Rey's office had described as a floor, not a ceiling. The plea included conspiracy and 2 counts of wire fraud. Sentencing was pending. The racketeering count remained active pending the 2 Jane Doe civil suits. The assault trial was local, county, a different courtroom, and a different judge and a different legal team than everything that had come before. It was also, in a way the other proceedings weren't, specifically about one moment. 1 room, 34 people. A sound like something load-bearing cracking. Sloan testified for 4 hours over 2 days. She was precise. She was not performing composure. She'd learned the difference between those 2 things somewhere in the past 14 months. The difference between the practiced stillness she'd worn in the ER-like equipment and the real kind, which was quieter and less perfect and came from having actually decided that she was going to be in this room saying these things no matter what it cost. Her voice broke once, briefly, during the second day, when the DA played the camera footage, and she heard the sound of it for the first time since it happened. She hadn't been prepared for that. She'd thought she was prepared, but hearing the sound of it in a quiet courtroom with a jury watching was different from knowing the footage existed. She stopped for a moment. She drank water. She continued. Weston's defense argued provocation, argued that Sloan's manner had been confrontational, argued that the incident had been isolated and anomalous for a man of distinguished service. The jury had the federal plea agreement in evidence, which made the argument about character somewhat difficult to sustain. They deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was guilty on the assault charge, a criminal conviction on the record in the county court system attached to Derek Weston's name permanently. The judge sentenced him to 18 months, which would run concurrent with whatever the federal sentencing produced, which meant practically speaking he might serve the assault time inside a federal sentence, or he might not, depending on how the federal calendar moved. Sato explained this to Sloan in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Sloan listened and nodded and understood that the law was imprecise about certain things, and that imprecision was not the same as failure. She stood in that hallway for a moment after Sato finished. The courthouse was a mid-century building with high ceilings and terrazzo floors, and that particular institutional smell, cleaning solution and old paper, and something underneath both that was the accumulated presence of 10,000 cases, 10,000 rooms full of people trying to get a true account of things into the official record. She thought it was not a bad smell, actually. She thought she'd smelled worse. Tomas was waiting outside on the courthouse steps. He'd come for the verdict, but hadn't come inside, which she understood without asking. Some things you could only do from a certain distance. He was in his regular clothes, a jacket against the November cold that was a different November cold than the one a year ago, which felt both very long ago and not long ago at all. "Well?" he said. "Guilty," she said. He nodded once. His jaw did something complicated. "Good," he said finally. "Just that." They stood there on the steps for a moment in the cold, not saying anything else, which was fine. There wasn't a lot to say that the silence didn't already hold. Cole Rader sent her a text when the verdict went public. 12 words. "Told you nobody is untouchable. They just haven't been exposed yet." She read it on the drive home and thought about sitting across from him at Dunmore's 2 weeks and a lifetime ago. His hands around a half-finished mug, the face-down legal pad, the specific decision he'd made to call a number that took some doing to find. He was not a hero in the way stories sometimes made people heroes, uncomplicated and purposeful from the beginning. He'd been a man with a separate agenda who'd witnessed something that connected to it, and he'd made a choice to do more than watch. That was all. It was enough. She texted back, "You were right." She drove the rest of the way home in the early dark, the same drive she'd made 14 months ago, except entirely different. The city going past her windows in its ordinary way, traffic and storefronts and people with somewhere to be, the unremarkable continuity of a place that had not paused for any of what she'd been through. Cities didn't pause. The world didn't pause. You moved through it changed, carrying the weight of what had happened, and eventually, not all at once, not cleanly, you found out what you were going to do with that weight. She'd found out. The patient advocacy protocols at Callaway General were formally adopted 7 months after Hartman took the interim directorship. The working group, Sloan, Tomas, a hospital attorney named Kim Farr, who turned out to be considerably more reform-minded than her title suggested, and a patient rights advocate from outside the institution named Paul Gentry, had met 11 times over 4 months and produced a 40-page document that Sloan thought was about 60% of what it should be, and which was therefore better than anything the hospital had had before. The protocols created an independent reporting pathway. They mandated witness documentation within 2 hours of any filed incident report. They established a clear chain of evidence custody for any digital documentation related to a complaint. They created a protected status for any staff member who participated in witness collection, specifically designed to prevent the kind of administrative leave that had been used against Tomas. The board adopted them unanimously. At the meeting where the adoption was announced, Hartman said something in the opening that Sloan had not expected. She named Sloan and Tomas by name from the podium, in front of the full board and the department heads in the working group, and she said, without softening it, that the protocols existed because 2 people had refused to let what happened to them be buried, and that the institution owed them more than a policy document, but that it was where you had to start. Sloan was sitting in the second row. She did not perform the moment. Her face did something real and brief, and she didn't try to stop it, and then she put it away and listened to the rest of the meeting because there were operational details that mattered. Afterward, in the parking structure, Tomas said, "How does it feel?" She thought about it, actually thought about it, instead of reaching for the first available answer. "Like it happened," she said. "Not like it's over, just like it actually happened, and now it's part of the record, and nobody can say it didn't." He considered that. "That's enough," he said. "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." There was a version of this story that ended with Sloan Merritt perfectly healed, fully resolved, walking through the hospital in the golden light of vindication, with everything behind her and everything ahead of her looking clean. That version was not available. What was available was the version she actually lived, the one where she still had nights sometimes, where she replayed the sound of it in a quiet courtroom, where she still noticed, in waiting rooms and corridors, the particular way a room went silent around a person with a certain kind of power, where she still had to consciously choose sometimes not to carry other people's contempt of her as though it said something true. She chose anyway. Every day that required choosing, she chose. The work at Callaway continued. The federal case against Weston moved through its remaining counts with the grinding slowness of large federal prosecutions. The 2 Jane Doe civil suits settled, different amounts, different terms, none of them perfect, all of them real. Patricia Weston gave a deposition that the U.S. Attorney described as among the most comprehensive witness statements in a case that had more than 400 pages of documentation. What it cost her to give that deposition was not something Sloan knew and not something she thought it was her place to assess. People made their accounting with themselves in private. That was their right. Adrienne Park kept her job. She was still at the registration desk, still coming in at 6:45, still the person who knew where every supply closet key was, and which attending was running late, and which family in the waiting room had been there longest and needed someone to check on them. She and Sloan didn't talk about the phone call. They didn't need to. It was there between them in the specific way things were there when you both knew exactly what they'd cost and had both decided it was worth it. That was what stayed. Not the verdict, not the indictment, not the policy document with 40 pages of procedural reform. Those mattered. They mattered in the permanent, official, get-it-on-the-record way that things needed to matter to be real. But what stayed in Sloan's body, the thing she carried into every subsequent shift and every difficult conversation and every moment when the easier path was silence, was something simpler and harder to articulate. She had stood in a doorway in a waiting room at 1:15 in the morning, and a man had tried to use her face to teach her something about her place in the world, and she had not learned what he intended. She had learned something else. That institutions protected the people who served their interests until they couldn't anymore, and that the thing that made them unable to anymore was other people refusing, one by one, to be the last one left holding silence. Tomas pulling the footage. Adrienne calling at 7:15 before she could unmake it. Rader in his chair with his magazine, watching. Patricia Weston's 3 days in a room with a box she didn't have to open. Nobody did this alone. Nobody did anything alone, and the people who believed they could were precisely the ones who built systems designed to keep everyone around them isolated. Take away the witnesses. Transfer the complainants, settle the cases, keep everyone in their separate rooms, convinced they were the only one. The only answer to that was the one they'd found. Don't stay in your room. She understood that she was a nurse who had spent 4 years becoming good at a job in a hospital in a mid-sized city and who had become, by accident and refusal, something slightly larger than that. Not a symbol. She had no interest in being a symbol, but a data point in the argument that silence was a choice and that choosing otherwise was survivable. Hard, costly. Sometimes lonely in the specific way that doing the right thing was lonely before enough other people came around. But survivable. She was back on nights. She preferred nights. The quality of the work was different after midnight, more concentrated. The department stripped down to what mattered. She still took the harder patients. She still stayed when the board was full. She still trained the new graduates without making them feel stupid for not knowing things they'd never been taught. She was not a different person. She was the same person, in possession of a more complete account of herself. On a Tuesday in March, 14 months, and change from the night that had started all of it, she came in for her shift and there was a message at the nurse's station. Old-fashioned, handwritten on a notepad by whoever had answered the desk phone, because some people still called the desk phone. The message said, Gerald Fiore called. Said he wanted you to know he's doing well. Said he remembered your name. She stood at the nurse's station and read it twice. Gerald Fiore, Bay 3. Internal bleed. Blood pressure dropping twice in the transport rig. Second IV line, while the rest of the department moved around her and a man with ribbons on his chest demanded the room she was standing in. He was doing well. He'd remembered her name. She folded the message and put it in her pocket and went to work.